My mother-in-law sold my late mother's jewelry until I evicted her from my guest suite. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I watched my husband's mother weep on my driveway, but all I could feel was the cold weight of my dead mother's sapphire ring in my pocket. The night air was heavy, thick with the exhaust of her idling sedan and the absolute finality of what I had just done. The driveway floodlights cast harsh, long shadows across the scattered designer luggage I had thrown onto the concrete. Helen's wailing pierced the quiet suburban silence, a desperate, theatrical sound designed to elicit pity. But staring at her from the porch, my chest was utterly hollow. Pity was a luxury I could no longer afford. I am Clara. I work long, quiet hours managing a local archive, surrounded by things meant to be preserved forever. 6 months ago, my entire world shattered when my mother died suddenly. She was my anchor, a woman of fierce grace who raised me entirely on her own. When she passed, she left me a heavy mahogany jewelry box. It wasn't just metal and stone. It was her legacy. Inside rested pieces she had accumulated over a lifetime of quiet struggle and hard-won triumphs. A delicate silver locket holding a picture of my grandparents. A heavy gold chain she wore every single day. And the centerpiece, an antique, deep-sea blue sapphire ring set in platinum, a family heirloom that predated the First World War. Opening that box was like breathing in her perfume. It was the only place I could still feel her pulse. I locked it in my bedroom, a silent shrine to a woman who deserved more time. I guarded that room like a vault. My husband, Mark, knew how much those pieces meant to me. He held me as I sobbed over them night after night. But Mark has a blind spot, a massive, gaping hole in his judgment, and her name is Helen. He always preferred the path of least resistance, a survival tactic learned from decades under his mother's thumb. I thought our home was my sanctuary, a fortress against the devastating waves of grief. I was horribly, completely wrong. The betrayal didn't start with a shattered window or a kicked-in door. It crept into my home wearing a cashmere shawl and carrying a suitcase. I had no idea the nightmare was just beginning. The trouble began just 2 months after my mother's funeral, while my grief was still a raw, bleeding wound. Helen called Mark on a Tuesday evening, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. Her landlord was supposedly selling her building, and she claimed she was completely destitute, staring down the barrel of immediate homelessness. I stood in the kitchen, listening to Mark pace the hardwood floor, his voice tight with anxiety as he promised to fix it. He hung up and looked at me with those pleading, exhausted eyes. Clara, she has nowhere else to go. Just for a little while. We have the new guest suite. The suite was a beautiful, sunlit addition we had just finished building, a space I had originally envisioned for my mother to stay in when she grew older. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. I didn't want Helen there. She was an overbearing, entitled woman who always looked at our home like a property she was waiting to inherit. But I was too exhausted by my own sorrow to fight a war on 2 fronts. I nodded. Within 48 hours, Helen had moved in. It was an invasion disguised as an extended visit. Instantly, the boundaries of our home blurred. She didn't just occupy the guest suite. She consumed the house. She rearranged the kitchen cabinets, complained about the brand of coffee I bought, and left her shoes directly in the center of the hallway. More disturbing was her brazen comfort with our private spaces. I would frequently come home from the archive to find the door to our master bedroom left ajar. When I confronted her, she would offer a sickeningly sweet smile, claiming she was just looking for a fresh towel or dusting the baseboards. I told Mark we needed to put a lock on the door. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and told me I was overreacting, that she was just trying to be helpful while I was mourning. He didn't see the calculating look in her eyes when she stared at my things. The feeling of being watched in my own home never truly faded away. The first time I noticed something missing, I convinced myself I was losing my mind. It was a rainy Thursday evening. I had spent the afternoon cataloging historical documents, my brain completely fried. I went to my bedroom, craving the small comfort of holding my mother's jewelry. I unlocked the heavy mahogany box and ran my fingers over the velvet lining. I stopped. The space where my mother's silver locket usually sat was empty. The locket was small, an engraved oval that she wore on special occasions. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through my chest. I tore the room apart. I stripped the bed, emptied the laundry hamper, and crawled on the floor with a flashlight, checking under the heavy oak dresser. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. When Mark came upstairs, he found me sitting on the floor, surrounded by discarded clothes, shaking violently. I told him the locket was gone. He knelt beside me, his face a mask of gentle, agonizing pity. "Clara, honey," he said softly, taking my hands. "You've been under so much stress. Grief does terrible things to our memory. You probably just misplaced it." I wanted to scream. I knew exactly where I had put it, but the soft certainty in his voice made me hesitate. Downstairs, Helen was sipping tea, completely unbothered by the frantic searching above her head. When I went down to get a glass of water, she looked up from her magazine. "Did you lose something, dear?" she asked, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "You really should be more careful with your things. A cluttered mind leads to a cluttered home." I stared at her, a dark, heavy knot forming in the pit of my stomach. Her eyes were perfectly calm, unblinking and entirely devoid of genuine concern. I backed away slowly, the sound of the rain beating against the windows. The silence in the kitchen felt oppressive, thicker than the humid air outside. I knew in my bones that the silver locket had not simply vanished. The gaslighting became a relentless, daily psychological torture. 2 weeks after the locket disappeared, a pair of pearl drop earrings vanished. Then, a heavy gold bangle my mother had bought in Italy. Each time, the ritual was the same. I would discover the empty space in the velvet-lined box. My heart would hammer against my ribs, and the frantic, tearing search of the bedroom would begin. And every single time, Mark would wrap his arms around me and softly explain away my reality. "It's grief brain, Clara," he would whisper, kissing my forehead. "The therapist said you might experience memory lapses. It's normal." Helen was far less gentle. She actively cultivated the narrative that I was mentally unraveling. During a dinner with Mark's sister, Helen loudly suggested that I needed stronger medication, implying my episodes were disturbing the peace of the house. "She wanders around looking for things she lost," Helen said, pouring herself more wine. "It's tragic, really. We're doing our best to manage her." I sat across the table, my knuckles white as I gripped my fork, physically vibrating with rage. I wasn't crazy. I knew my mother's collection intimately. I knew the weight of each piece, the specific sound the latch made when the box closed. I began taking photos of the jewelry box contents every morning before leaving for work, but I was so deeply entrenched in the fog of their gaslighting that I doubted my own photographic evidence, wondering if I had somehow moved things in my sleep. The worst part was the isolation. My own husband looked at me like a fragile, broken bird, while his mother roamed my halls with absolute impunity. The walls of my sanctuary were shrinking, closing in on me. I felt like a prisoner in a glass cage, screaming for help while my captors calmly discussed the weather. Then I noticed the subtle, sickening changes in Helen's daily wardrobe. The physical evidence of Helen's newfound wealth was impossible to ignore. Despite claiming complete financial ruin just months prior, she suddenly began receiving packages from high-end boutiques. She paraded through the kitchen wearing a pristine, tailored silk blouse, the tags suspiciously absent. When I asked her about it, she waved her hand dismissively, claiming she found it at a thrift store. But the fabric was flawless, the cut undeniably expensive. The breaking point arrived on a Sunday afternoon. My fiercely loyal best friend, Sarah, came over for coffee. We sat on the patio, the autumn air crisp and biting. Helen was in the living room, her voice carrying through the open window as she spoke on the phone. She was talking to her other son, David, her absolute golden child who had a notorious history of terrible business investments. "Don't worry about the rent, Davy," Helen cooed into the receiver. "Mommy handled it. The transfer should clear by tomorrow morning." Sarah stopped mid-sip, her eyes locking onto mine over the rim of her mug. She lowered the cup slowly, her expression hardening into absolute steel. "Clara," Sarah whispered, leaning across the iron table, "where is a supposedly bankrupt woman getting the cash to bail out her deadbeat son?" I froze. The disjointed pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together with a violent, terrifying clarity. The missing jewelry, the new clothes, the sudden influx of cash. Mark had explicitly told me he wasn't giving her money. I had been so blinded by grief and so manipulated by their constant chorus of my memory lapses that I hadn't looked at the most obvious answer. Sarah grabbed my hand, squeezing it hard enough to bruise. "You aren't crazy," she said, her voice a fierce, low hiss. "Open your eyes." The wind rustled the dead leaves around us, sounding like a warning whisper. I knew I had to search the guest suite the moment she left. The opportunity presented itself the following Tuesday. Helen announced she was going to a matinee with her bridge club. I watched her sedan pull out of the driveway, waiting until the taillights vanished around the corner. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I walked down the hall to the guest suite. I pushed the door open. The room smelled strongly of her overpowering floral perfume and stale mints. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but the detective instinct had fully taken over. I moved systematically, checking under the mattress, rifling through the dresser drawers, keeping everything exactly as I found it. I was a ghost in my own house. Then, I checked the small woven trash can next to her vanity. Beneath a layer of discarded tissues and makeup wipes, I spotted a crumpled piece of heavy cardstock. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling as I smoothed the wrinkles against the polished wood of the vanity. It was a receipt. The header read, "Gary's Gold and Estate Buyers, located 3 towns over." The date printed at the top was exactly 1 day after I first noticed my mother's silver locket missing. The item description was painfully brief: vintage silver locket with engraving. The payout amount was pitiful, a fraction of its actual worth, handed over in cold, hard cash. My blood ran ice cold, freezing in my veins. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. All the gaslighting, all the patronizing looks from Mark, all the times I questioned my own sanity. It crashed over me in a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered fury. She hadn't just stolen from me. She had desecrated my mother's memory to fund her favorite child's lifestyle, while living under my roof and eating the food I bought. I slipped the receipt into my pocket and carefully backed out of the room. The piece of paper in my hand was the key to her destruction. I drove to Gary's Gold and Estate Buyers the next morning, taking a personal day from the archive. The shop was a dusty, heavily fortified storefront tucked between a dying laundromat and a liquor store. A bell chimed harshly as I pushed the thick glass door open. The air inside smelled of brass polish and stale cigar smoke. Behind the reinforced counter stood Gary, a burly man in his 50s with shrewd, calculating eyes behind thick wire-rimmed glasses. I didn't waste time. I pulled the smoothed-out receipt from my purse and placed it flat on the glass display case. I introduced myself and described Helen down to her obnoxious floral perfume and the specific way she pursed her lips when lying. Gary sighed, wiping a cloth over a silver tray. "Yeah, I know her," he grumbled, his voice like grinding gravel. "Comes in every couple of weeks. Always has some sob story about liquidating her late husband's estate to pay medical bills." I felt a fresh wave of nausea. I pulled up a high-resolution photo on my phone, the picture I took of the full velvet box. I zoomed in on the pearl drop earrings and the heavy Italian gold bangle. "Did she bring these in?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. Gary pulled out a heavy, leather-bound logbook from beneath the counter. He flipped through the thick pages, tracing a thick finger down the columns of scrawled handwriting. He tapped the page. "Right here," he said. "Paid out $600 for the bangle last Thursday." The pearls went into the melting scrap pile. I gripped the edge of the counter, the room spinning violently. My mother's beautiful jewelry, things she wore while holding me as a child, melted down for quick cash. "Do you still have the locket?" I whispered, terrified of the answer. Gary shook his head slowly. He told me he sold the locket to a collector out of state. I walked out of the shop with a burning need for absolute vengeance. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car outside the pawn shop, I pieced together the sick, twisted mechanics of Helen's operation. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, putting her on speaker as I stared blankly at the brick wall of the laundromat. I recounted the conversation with Gary, my voice eerily devoid of emotion. Sarah was silent for a long moment before letting out a sharp, venomous string of curses. The reality was so much worse than a simple theft. Helen wasn't stealing because she was desperate for survival. She was systematically fencing my dead mother's most sacred possessions to bankroll David's failures and line her own pockets. She sat at my dining table, eating meals I cooked, while secretly stripping my history away piece by piece. She felt entitled to it. In her twisted mind, She deserved the financial cushion more than I deserved the sentimental comfort of my mother's legacy. And Mark, my husband, the man who promised to protect me, had served as her unwitting shield, continuously deflecting my suspicions and labeling me as hysterical. If I confronted Mark right now with just the receipt, Helen would spin it. She was a master manipulator. She would claim she found the items in the trash, or that I had given them to her in a grief-induced haze and forgotten. She would cry, she would hyperventilate, and Mark, terrified of conflict, would try to find a middle ground where there was none. I couldn't allow a middle ground. I needed a weapon so sharp and undeniable that it would sever her ties to my husband forever. I needed to catch the predator in the absolute act. I wiped the remaining tears from my face and started the car's engine. The trap I was about to set had to be utterly flawless and cruel. I drove directly to an electronics store on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I navigated the aisles, bypassing the standard home security systems. I needed something discreet, something a tech-illiterate woman like Helen would never notice in a million years. I found it in the specialty surveillance section, a high-definition nanny cam hidden inside a fully functional digital alarm clock. It recorded directly to a secure cloud server and streamed live to an app on my phone. I paid in cash to ensure the purchase wouldn't show up on any joint bank statements Mark might check. When I got home, the house was empty. I walked into the master bedroom and locked the door behind me. I removed the old alarm clock from my nightstand and plugged in the new one, angling it perfectly so the lens had a wide, unobstructed view of the heavy mahogany jewelry box sitting on the dresser. I tested the feed on my phone. The picture was razor-sharp, capturing the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. Next, I needed the bait. I opened the box. There were only a few pieces left, but one was unmistakable, the antique sapphire ring. It was the most valuable item my mother owned, the piece Helen had undoubtedly been saving for her grand finale. I carefully removed it from its velvet slot and placed it on the polished wood of the dresser right next to the box, making it look as though I had taken it out to look at and absent-mindedly forgotten to put it away. It sat there, a glittering blue target under the hidden lens. I packed a small overnight bag, making sure my movements were loud enough to be heard throughout the house. I was setting the stage. I took one last look at the camera angle before unlocking the bedroom door. All I had to do now was wait for the thief to strike. Helen was sitting in the living room watching a game show when I carried my overnight bag down the stairs. I paused in the archway, plastering a tired, apologetic smile onto my face. "Helen," I said, projecting my voice over the television. "I have to go into the city for an archival conference. I'm staying overnight at a hotel near the venue. Mark is working late, so you'll have the house to yourself tonight." Helen's eyes briefly flicked away from the screen, landing on my duffel bag. A microscopic shift occurred in her posture, a subtle straightening of her spine, the sudden alertness of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Oh, don't worry about me, dear," she said, her tone dripping with fake maternal warmth. "You go focus on your work. It's good for you to get out. You've been so scattered lately." It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to drop the bag and physically drag her out the front door right then. "Thank you," I managed to choke out. "I left a few things out on my dresser in my rush, but I'll handle it tomorrow." The bait was set. I walked out to my car, tossing the bag into the passenger seat. I didn't drive to the city. I drove exactly 4 blocks away, parking in the dimly lit lot of a close community center. I texted Sarah the address, and within 10 minutes, she pulled in beside me, climbing into my passenger seat with 2 large coffees and a grim expression. I mounted my phone on the dashboard, opening the camera app. The live feed loaded, showing my empty, quiet bedroom, the sapphire ring gleaming softly in the fading evening light. The trap was armed. We sat in the dark, the engine off, waiting for the movement notification. Sarah gripped her coffee cup tightly, her eyes locked intensely on the small screen. The silence in the car was shattered by a sharp chime from my phone. The motion alert flashed red across the top of my phone screen. Sarah gasped, leaning in closer. On the high-definition feed, the master bedroom door slowly creaked open. Helen slipped into the room, moving with a practiced, terrifying stealth. She didn't turn on the overhead light, relying on the ambient glow from the hallway. I watched my mother-in-law prowl through my sanctuary, her eyes immediately locking onto the dresser. She paused, and for a heart-stopping second, she looked directly toward the digital alarm clock. I held my breath, my fingernails digging viciously into the steering wheel. If she noticed the lens, the entire plan would instantly collapse. She reached out, her fingers hovering near the clock. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Then, she simply adjusted the angle of the clock face to check the time, completely oblivious to the camera recording her every microscopic movement. She turned her attention to the sapphire ring resting on the wood. The camera caught the greedy, triumphant smirk that twisted her features. She picked up the ring, holding it up to catch the dim light, admiring the deep blue stone. She didn't hesitate. She dropped my dead mother's most treasured possession into the deep pocket of her cardigan. Then, to my absolute horror, she casually opened my top dresser drawer and began sifting through my private documents, looking for more cash. Sarah let out a low, feral growl next to me. The footage was perfect. It was irrefutable, undeniable proof of a malicious, calculated theft. The gaslighting was officially over. I reached for the ignition, my hands shaking not from grief, but from a sheer, unadulterated surge of adrenaline. I pulled up Mark's contact in my phone and hit call. The engine roared to life in the dark parking lot, echoing my internal rage. I told my husband to come home immediately if he wanted to save his marriage. Mark's voice on the phone was laced with exhaustion and confusion. "Clara? What's wrong? I thought you were at the hotel in the city." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My voice was a flat, dead calm that immediately terrified him. "Cancel your late shift. Come home right now. Don't call your mother. Just get here." I hung up before he could ask another question. I threw the car into drive and sped back down the 4 blocks to our house. Sarah followed closely behind in her own car, serving as my designated witness. When we pulled into the driveway, Mark was just pulling up to the curb, his tires screeching slightly. He jumped out, his face pale under the streetlights. "Clara, what the hell is happening?" he demanded, rushing toward me. I held up a hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Walk inside," I commanded, "and don't say a single word." We entered the house in total silence. I marched directly into the living room, grabbing the television remote. I synced my phone to the smart TV. Helen was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she poured a glass of wine. Hearing the front door, she walked into the living room, the glass in her hand, the stolen sapphire ring still sitting in the pocket of her cardigan. "Oh, you're back early," she started to say, putting on her sickly sweet smile. I pressed play on my phone. The massive 60-inch screen instantly illuminated the dark room with the high-definition footage. There was Helen, in vivid color, sneaking into my room, smirking, and slipping the ring into her pocket. The sound of her rummaging through my drawers echoed loudly through the living room speakers. Mark froze, his eyes locked on the screen. The absolute silence in the room was heavier than the humid summer air outside. The wine glass slipped from Helen's trembling fingers and shattered violently on the hardwood floor. The shattering glass broke the spell. Mark slowly turned his head from the television screen to his mother. His face had drained of all color, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "Mom," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Tell me that isn't real." Helen panicked. The pristine mask she had worn for months violently peeled away, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. She took a step back, her eyes darting between me, Mark, and the frozen image of her theft on the TV. "She faked it," Helen shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That's edited. Clara is sick, Mark. You know she's mentally unstable." I didn't say a word. I simply walked over to her, reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan, and pulled out the antique sapphire ring. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, the blue stone catching the overhead light. Mark looked at the ring, then back at his mother. Decades of manipulation, of making excuses, of blinding himself to her toxic reality shattered in that single moment. "You stole from her," Mark whispered, stepping toward her. "Her mother is dead, and you stole from her." Helen burst into frantic, theatrical tears, dropping to her knees. "I needed the money, Mark. David is in trouble. The loan sharks are after him." I had no choice. The admission hung in the air, a vile, toxic cloud. She hadn't just stolen. She had gaslit me, convinced my husband I was losing my mind, and desecrated my mother's memory for a gambling debt. I looked down at the woman weeping on my floor, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard resolve. I turned to Mark, my voice echoing off the walls. The decision was absolute, and I would not entertain a single word of negotiation. I told him she had exactly 1 hour to pack her things and leave forever. The next hour was pure, chaotic destruction. Helen wailed, alternating between sobbing apologies and vicious, hateful insults directed at me. She screamed that I was tearing a family apart, that I was a cold, heartless bitch. I didn't engage. I stood in the hallway with Sarah, guarding my bedroom door, while Mark silently dragged garbage bags out of the kitchen and threw them into the guest suite. To his credit, Mark didn't hesitate. The shock had burned away his conditioning. He physically packed his mother's clothes, shoving designer blouses and expensive shoes into the black plastic bags with aggressive force. When she tried to cling to his arm, begging him not to abandon her, he shoved her off. "You're dead to me," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble I had never heard before. "Get your bags and get out of my house." He carried the heavy luggage outside, throwing it violently onto the concrete driveway. The floodlights illuminated the pathetic pile of her belongings. I followed them out, standing on the porch as she scrambled to load her sedan, her mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her face. She looked at me one last time, her eyes burning with a venomous, unrepentant hatred. I didn't blink. I simply turned my back and walked inside, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Mark collapsed onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The toxic presence was finally purged from our home, but the collateral damage left in her wake was immense. The house felt incredibly empty. I walked over to the sofa and placed a hesitant hand on my husband's shoulder. The brutal work of repairing our fractured marriage and recovering the jewelry had just begun. The aftermath was a grueling, agonizing process of excavation. I spent the next 3 weeks tracking down every piece of jewelry Helen had fenced. Gary helped me locate the buyers, and though it cost thousands of dollars from our savings, I managed to buy back the bangle and the locket. The pearl earrings were lost forever, melted down into anonymous scrap. Mark and I entered intensive couples counseling immediately. The revelation of his mother's true nature broke something fundamental inside him, but it also forced him to confront his lifelong habit of avoiding conflict at my expense. He cut all contact with Helen and David, blocking their numbers and ignoring the frantic letters she sent to our house. We are healing, slowly, building new boundaries reinforced by steel. The guest suite has been completely gutted and transformed into a reading room. I refuse to let it remain a monument to her invasion. Looking back, the entire nightmare taught me a brutal but necessary lesson about grief and boundaries. When you are mourning, you are incredibly vulnerable, and toxic people will smell that weakness like blood in the water. They will weaponize your trauma to serve their own entitlement. Never let anyone, especially family, convince you to ignore your own reality. If your gut tells you something is deeply wrong in your own sanctuary, you must listen to it. Protect your peace with ruthless aggression, and never let anyone cross your threshold who doesn't respect the ground you walk on. My mother's memory survived the violation, stronger and more resilient than before. The house is finally quiet again, filled only with the sounds of our own lives moving forward. I still lock the mahogany box every night, but not out of fear. I lock it because the things inside are sacred, and I am the only guardian they will ever need. The sapphire ring remains on my finger, a cold, beautiful reminder of the war I won.